Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be talking about David Hume. For anyone out there who's already got a good grasp of philosophy, so we're going beyond the basics here.
Right.
It's kind of like, if you were prepping for a graduate seminar or something like that.
Yeah.
And our main source for this is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Hume.
Yeah, Hume's one of those figures who, everybody knows he's important, but just how far his influence spreads is always sort of remarkable to me.
Oh, for sure.
You see him cited, in all sorts of areas of philosophy, but then you go beyond philosophy and, Adam Smith is using Hume, for economics.
Yeah.
Kant's responding to Hume, even Darwin, there are
Wow.
ways to sort of connect Darwin to Hume.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I always think it's amazing how these figures, they just keep
Yeah.
rippling out through time. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, who was David Hume?
So he was born in Scotland in 1711.
Okay.
And went to university at the age of 12, which
Wow.
is,
Incredible.
yeah, tried to do law, hated it.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. Had a bit of a mental breakdown in his early 20s.
Yeah.
Moved to France to try to recover, and then
Yeah.
that's when he wrote the treatise of human nature.
Okay, so a mental breakdown, and then goes on to write one of the most important works
Yeah.
in Western philosophy.
Yeah. Who knows what exactly led to it, but there you go.
Yeah.
Some people But yeah, the treatise was controversial to say the least.
Yeah.
It got him labeled as a skeptic, as an atheist. He
Wow.
never got a university job because of his reputation from the treatise.
So he got kicked out of academia.
Basically. Yeah.
But he went on to publish the Inquiries and even wrote a best-selling history of England.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
yeah, he kept busy.
So he's a man of many talents.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about some of the ideas that got him into so much trouble.
Yeah.
Hume had this radical idea of basically applying the scientific method to human nature itself.
Yeah.
It's almost like he wanted to be the Newton of the mind.
Oh, yeah.
And he rejected metaphysics. He
Yeah.
thought that it was too speculative.
Yeah.
It wasn't grounded in actual experience.
Yeah, he thought that, we need to base our theories about human nature on observation and experience, on being empiricists.
Yeah, on what we can actually observe.
Yeah, and he was a naturalist, so he didn't think that we needed to appeal to anything supernatural to explain things.
Okay, so no mysterious forces,
Right.
no divine interventions. It's all about the natural world and the observable.
Yeah, and our experience of it.
And this brings us to his famous distinction between impressions and ideas, which are kind of like the building blocks of his whole system.
Right, so impressions are like the vivid, immediate sensations that we have. So, you see a red apple, the redness of the apple, the feeling of its smoothness,
Oh.
that's an impression. And then the idea of the apple is a kind of a faint copy of that impression that you can have later on when you're not actually looking at an apple.
Right. So I'm looking at this beautiful, vivid painting. That's the impression. And then later on, I'm trying to remember the painting. That's the idea.
That's right.
It's a little bit more faded.
Exactly. And the relation between these two is really important for him. So he has this principle called the copy principle, which says that all of our simple ideas are derived from impressions.
Okay.
So every idea that we have ultimately has to come from some sensory experience.
So we're born as blank slates, and then through these impressions, through
Yeah.
our experience, that's how we come to know the world.
Yeah, that's right.
But, I know that he himself actually brought up some problems with this.
Yeah.
Like the missing shade of blue example.
Yeah, it's the missing shade of blue.
So you've seen every shade of blue except one very specific shade. Could you still form an idea of that missing shade, even though you've never actually seen it?
Right, and he seems to think maybe you could.
It would kind of go against this copy principle.
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle.
Yeah.
Does it disprove Hume, or does it show how closely he was paying attention to experience?
It's a question. So he takes these impressions and ideas, and then he kind of uses them to analyze more complex concepts.
Right.
He had this method that he called definition, which he likened to a new microscope for the mind.
Yeah.
What did he mean by that? A microscope for the mind.
Well, he thought that you could analyze the meaning of our ideas by breaking them down and tracing them back to their original impressions.
Okay.
So if you have an idea, what's the impression that it's ultimately derived from?
And if you can't find the impression,
Yeah, then maybe you should worry.
then it's meaningless.
Yeah, it's meaningless. It's just a word.
Oh, wow.
So he used this to go after a lot of philosophical jargon that he thought was meaningless.
So basically he's saying no more fuzzy thinking.
Right.
You've got to ground your ideas in experience.
Yeah.
But, our thoughts aren't just this jumble of isolated impressions and ideas.
Yeah.
There's kind of a flow of connection.
Yeah.
So how did he explain that?
So that's where his principles of association come in. He says there are three principles: resemblance, contiguity, and causation.
Okay, so resemblance first. How does that work?
Well, resemblance is, if you see a picture of your childhood home, you immediately think of your childhood home. That's because the picture resembles the house.
Because it looks like it.
Right.
Okay.
And then contiguity
Contiguity.
is things that are close together in space and time. So if I hear a particular song, I might remember, the summer that I first heard that song.
Oh.
And that's just because the two were together in
Or they were experienced together.
Right.
Okay, and then there's causation, which, that one's a big one.
Yeah.
Right? It's the idea that one event causes another event.
Yeah.
Like if I touch a hot stove and get burned, then in the future, I know not to touch the hot stove.
Right. You've learned.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably the most powerful of the three principles. And it's the one that gives us a sense of order and regularity in the world.
Right. So it lets us predict what's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's also the one that he has the most radical thing to say about.
Okay. So we've talked about his life, his emphasis on experience,
Right.
the distinction between impressions and ideas, the copy principle, his method of definition.
Yeah.
And this all sets the stage for his work on causation, which is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah.
And possibly a little bit mind-bending.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is where, his empiricism leads him to this really radical conclusion.
Okay.
He says we never actually observe a necessary connection between cause and effect.
Okay, so help me understand this.
Yeah.
Like when I see one billiard ball hit another billiard ball and then the second one moves,
Right.
I'm not actually seeing the force of the first ball
Yeah.
causing the second ball to move.
That's right.
I'm just seeing two events happening.
Yeah, all you're seeing is one ball moving towards another ball.
Sequentially, yeah.
They touch, and then the other ball moves away.
So where does the idea of causation come from then?
Well, he thinks that it comes from our minds. It comes from the fact that we've seen this kind of thing happen over and over and over again.
Okay.
So we come to expect it.
We associate those two events.
Right.
Yeah.
But he says, that feeling of necessity that we have,
Right.
that doesn't come from the objects themselves. It comes from our minds.
So it's more about our habits of mind than it is about something that we're observing.
Right. Exactly.
Like we're imposing a pattern on the world.
Yeah, that's right.
Rather than discovering a pattern that's already there.
Yeah, and that's a pretty radical claim, to say that what we think of as, this fundamental feature of the universe.
Right, cause and effect.
Right, cause and effect.
Yeah.
It's actually just, a feature of our minds. It's
Yeah.
a psychological phenomenon.
Wow.
And, it makes you sort of wonder, what can we really know then about the world?
Yeah. It makes everything feel a lot less certain,
Yeah.
a lot less stable.
Yeah.
If we're not actually observing causation,
Right.
how can we predict anything?
Yeah. So this is one of those moments where Hume's, being a real tough teacher, he's like,
Yeah.
he wants to shake us out of our complacency.
Yeah.
He wants us to really think about, what are the limits of our knowledge?
So it's not about despair.
No.
It's about being more
Yeah.
humble about what we can know.
Right. We can still make predictions,
Yeah.
but we should just be aware that, those predictions are always fallible.
Yeah.
They're based on limited experience.
Right. It's all based on probability.
Yeah.
So this emphasis on experience and the limits of reason,
Yeah.
it seemed to have implications for his moral philosophy as well.
Right.
Because if we can't even be certain about cause and effect in the physical world,
Yeah.
how can we be certain about moral truths?
Yeah, so that's exactly what he thinks about morality, too. So he rejects the idea that you can get morality from reason alone.
Okay.
He was very critical of the moral rationalists,
Right.
who thought that you could just sit in your armchair and figure out,
Figure it all out.
yeah, all
Mhm.
the moral truths just by thinking about it.
So instead of pure reason, he's looking to
He's looking to our feelings.
her feelings.
Yeah, our sentiments.
Sentiments.
Yeah, and he calls this view sentimentalism.
Okay.
So he thinks that, when we see somebody acting in a way that we approve of,
Yeah.
we have this feeling of approval.
Yeah.
And when we see somebody acting in a way that we disapprove of, we have a feeling of disapproval.
So it's an emotional response,
It's an emotional response.
not an intellectual response.
That's right.
So it's almost like our gut reaction is what tells
Yeah.
us whether something is right or wrong.
And those gut reactions are based on,
Okay.
features, of our human nature.
Right.
They're not just arbitrary.
But if it's based on feelings, then wouldn't that make morality subjective?
Yeah.
So wouldn't that mean that what's right for one person might be wrong for another person?
Right. That's the worry about sentimentalism.
Yeah.
Does it make morality relative?
Yeah.
But Hume says no.
Okay.
Because even though our feelings are subjective, they are rooted in this, shared human nature.
So there's still some common ground.
That's right.
Okay.
And he thinks that our capacity for sympathy is very important here.
Okay.
So sympathy for Hume means, being able to share in other people's feelings.
Right, being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes.
Yeah, to see things from their perspective and to feel what they're feeling.
So empathy is what connects us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And allows us to form these
Yeah.
moral judgments.
That's right.
And sympathy also kind of explains why we would act altruistically,
Right.
right?
Mm.
Not just out of self-interest, but out of a genuine concern for others.
Yeah, he didn't think that human beings were as selfish as some philosophers thought.
Yeah.
He thought that we had this genuine capacity for
Varying.
for caring about others.
So sympathy is a really important part of his ethical theory.
Yeah, it's kind of the glue that holds society together.
The glue that holds society together.
Yeah.
Okay.
He even thought it explains why we have, justice and property and all these.
Right. So we need to have some rules in place.
Right.
Yeah.
To make sure that, society functions smoothly.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion of his moral philosophy.
Yeah.
But we can't wrap up this episode without talking about one of his most controversial works,
Okay.
Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion.
Right.
In this, he's taking on the classic arguments for God's existence.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear how his approach to religion kind of fits in with the rest of his philosophy.
Right.
Because, he's all about experience in the limits of reason.
Right. Well, in the dialogues, he presents a bunch of different arguments for and against the existence of God.
Yeah.
But he doesn't really come down definitively on one side or the other.
Oh, so he leaves it open.
Yeah, he leaves it pretty open.
But through his characters, and especially the character of Philo,
Right.
he's raising all these doubts about the traditional arguments for God.
Yeah.
And especially the argument from design.
The argument from design.
So remind us, what is the argument from design?
So the argument from design is the idea that, the universe looks like it's been designed.
Right? Like a watch.
Yeah, like a watch.
It's so intricate and complex.
Right.
Yeah.
So it must have a designer.
So how does Hume attack that argument?
Well, first of all, he says that the analogy between a watch and the universe is not a very good analogy.
Okay, why not?
Well, because we've seen people make watches.
Right.
But we've never seen anybody make a universe.
We have no experience of that.
Yeah, we don't know how universes are made.
Right.
So we can't just assume that the same principles apply.
Right. We can't compare something that's human-made to something that's,
Right.
Potentially
Cosmic in scale.
cosmic in scale. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a one-to-one analogy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then even if we grant that there might be a designer,
Yeah.
he says we can't infer anything about the nature of that designer just
wow.
from looking at the design.
So we don't know if the designer's good or evil,
We don't know if they're good.
powerful or weak.
Yeah, all we know is that, something caused this universe to exist.
It's a very humbling realization.
Yeah.
I mean, if even a mind as brilliant as Hume
Right.
is acknowledging the limitations of our knowledge,
Yeah.
where does that leave us?
Well, I think, one of the things that Hume is trying to teach us is to be okay with not knowing everything.
With the mystery.
Yeah, to embrace the mystery.
Yeah, it really is humbling.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I feel like his skepticism, it could be easy to write it off as just this kind of abstract intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
But it really has these deep implications for how we see ourselves and our place in the world.
Yeah, it changes how you think about things.
Yeah.
If you take him seriously.
Yeah, and I mean, in the Stanford Encyclopedia article, it really emphasized this idea that, we have a limited human perspective.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're looking through this tiny keyhole
Right.
and we're trying to make pronouncements about this vast reality
Yeah.
that's beyond our comprehension.
Yeah. He's very suspicious of
Right.
big metaphysical systems
Yeah.
that claim to have all the answers.
Yeah.
He's much more interested in, what can we know for sure based on our experience?
So, I mean, if a mind as brilliant as Hume is saying, hey, we have these limitations,
Yeah.
what hope do we have? I mean, does this mean that philosophy is just a futile exercise?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I mean, for him, acknowledging those limitations is
Yeah.
the first step to,
Yeah.
actually making progress.
So it's about being more realistic about our goals.
Right. And about our methods.
Okay.
About, what are the right questions to ask?
Yeah.
What are the right ways to go about answering those questions?
Instead of trying to find some grand unifying theory of everything,
Yeah, he's not interested in that.
it's more about kind of focusing in
Yeah.
on specific problems
Right.
that we can actually wrap our minds around.
Yeah.
So it's less about reaching the destination and more about enjoying the journey.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a reminder that, the search for understanding is an ongoing process.
It never ends.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great takeaway from our deep dive into David Hume today.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about his emphasis on experience, the limits of reason, his work on causation.
His moral philosophy.
Yeah, and so much more.
Yeah. It's amazing how much,
Yeah,
he was able to fit into one lifetime.
he's a busy guy.
Yeah.
So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep reading Hume,
Yeah.
explore the secondary literature, and most importantly, keep asking these big questions.
Yeah.
You never know what you might discover.
Yeah.
So until next time, everyone, happy
Mhm.
philosophizing.